implement the classrooms to provide a classroom for all these kids coming in. So to get the money to them first, that's what we'll do. We'll also move to the 100,080 hours, which is the $7 to $12. And so that will get done in this biennium. And we believe by doing that, we get money to students first. Right now, the implementation schedule is to fund MSOC and transportation. We believe getting money to all-day kindergarten and to the 1,080 hours, and then as we progress, we move into the K-3 class size reduction, and then to MSOC, and then to transportation. So I'm going to move to JT, and then as it comes back to me, I can talk about those policies that we're going to put in place.
Well, I think it's plain to everybody that the central challenge for all four caucuses plus the governor in this biennium is to figure out a way to balance the needs of students, the McCleary decision, and the clear preference taxpayers. We have a high bar for taxes. When you look at the players, the governor, while he was running for office, made it plain that he was not in favor of new taxes. House Republicans are not in favor of new taxes, and the majority caucus has not been in favor of new taxes. So this plan will be the first one that's presented that provides a roadmap for how we do that. The voters of Washington have so consistently told us that they believe in a 2/3 bar. That doesn't mean no taxes. That means that it should be a clear priority for the majority of the legislature before taxes are raised. And that protection's gone now. So we think it's doubly important for us and for the taxpayers and voters of Washington that we find a way to fulfill our primary duty to the students and hold the line on taxes. And that's what we're doing.
Thanks, JT. The first thing I'd like to do is get you any answers to questions about the Fund Education First component of this budget. If you have any questions regarding that, then I'll be glad to move into the question about the rest of the budget. As Representative Dahlquist indicated, we feel the commitment is there. We laid out a 6-year plan to meet the full commitments of the McCleary decision as we see them, and basically we just have reprioritized from our standpoint where we start, because we want to start with the best solution for the kids. And we believe all-day kindergarten and class size reduction have been validated as being the most important thing to helping our children be prepared to graduate with a commitment when they go on for a career or go on to post-secondary education. We're going to continue along the line of meeting those material supply and operating costs. We're going to provide the schools with the tools to do the job, and we will also, at some point in time, basically be responsible for the required changes in transportation formula funding to ensure that we have the most efficient transportation system. Along with that, as Kathy indicated, we believe that we need accountability measures, and a number of those bills that are on your list address the accountability measures and the ability for us to evaluate how we're doing in that job. So with that, are there any questions about the education funding too?
For Representative Dahlquist, the numbers on here are less than the Joint Education Funding Task Force of late last year. Can you explain why?
The minority or the majority report? The majority
report.
Well, the majority report, as you know, and if you were part of those discussions on the task force, they grew, as I kept saying, they grew the box. So 2261 and 2776 were very specific in what they funded. And the box got, you know, it ended up like a Christmas tree during the funding task force, where new ideas and new programs were attached to that required large additional dollars. And it was my belief that that was done to be able to go out to the voters and hold kids hostage for a tax increase. So if you make the box so big and you add things like career and college readiness, increased teacher compensation, all having huge price tags, all of them legitimate ideas, there was no way you could get to, you know, to fully funding without a tax increase.
Okay, just wanted to throw the semantics of your answer back at you on one thing. It implied that the Democrats, or the people on the majority side, want a tax increase. You say, hold kids hostage for a tax increase.
Absolutely.
It's like, it comes off saying, gee, I'm a Democrat, I just like tax increases just on general principles.
Well, I can tell you during the funding task force, that was the proposals within the majority report. If you looked at that closely, you can see that there were 4 provisions for different types of tax increases. No budget was ever created within the recommendation of the funding task force that included a budget that didn't include a tax increase. So absolutely, it did include a tax increase. Everything from a sales tax increase to a capital gains tax to a property tax increase, you name it, it was in there.
Can you clarify what numbers we're talking about just before we go much further? Is it a net of 560 million? That is the increase that you're talking about?
Yes, the net of 562, but that includes the suspension of the I-732 COLA increases, which were, I believe, close to $300 million that basically was suspended in that net number.
The school districts get most funding all in one chunk, so essentially you're talking about giving them a little more than $500,000 more. Is that a sufficient down payment on McCleary?
No, I think we're giving them more than $800 million more in McCleary, and a total commitment of $1.5 billion more than the current biennium. Part of that is the restitution of the 1.9% salary reductions we took in the current biennium, and 3% for some of the non-certified employees. So we will resume the reductions we made in compensation, but we will not be adding new commitments to the compensation requirements in this budget.
Right, I'm just trying to figure out, if you're giving with one hand and taking with the other, if the net increase beyond the what would be happening under current law is 550 million, is that a sufficient amount of increase to really make a dent in the problem that the Supreme Court says we have?
I think it's I think it is, because the fact is we are addressing the additional requests regarding those components that Representative Dahlquist indicated in those 2 bills, 2261 and 2776. I do not believe that any caucus will be continuing or not suspending 732 as part of their solution in K-12 education. And that does not take away from the commitment we're making to the McCleary Supreme Court decision.
And I think it's important to remember that I-732 has been deducted from the last several biennial budgets as well. So because it's current law, that had to be included in the maintenance level. However, I think that it is accurate to talk about well over 800 million in additional.
Okay. So Gary, you were just mentioning a second ago that we've got a $1.5 billion increase in the K-12 budget, and I guess that $90 million of that is spending that is either for McCleary or else $86 million into the policy enhancements. Okay, you were saying that part of the remaining $600 million then is for restoration of the salary cut. What are the other places where you can be putting additional money into?
Well, there are some additional maintenance level areas. One of that is in the additional money for enrollment. And so we have additional dollars being committed to K-12. For example, there's in the caseload forecast council that came out today, $75 million was part of the most recent caseload forecast dollars. So that all that is part of that remaining difference in terms of we basically are not eliminating or reducing any of the ongoing basic education policy requirements that are in the current biennium. So.
I think it'd be worth looking at House Bill 1424, for example. That's a bill that we all supported. It came out this week. And the major cost component of that program, which we supported, wasn't exactly the program, but the additional caseload that was generated if it's successful in preventing dropouts.
Yeah, okay. Now, in order to take a whack at the liquidity problem, you guys are allocating $800 million. And that is the lowest figure that I've heard anybody use so far. I've heard figures of anywhere from $1 billion all the way up to $2.5 billion.
Well,
Now, I'm just wondering though, is this a matter of fact or is it a matter of opinion that this is sufficient to satisfy the Supreme Court?
well, I don't know what fact is because we won't know that until we produce the budget and get the response from the Supreme Court. But this number was not a question of just getting to a figure. It was our response to how we prioritized meeting the expectations that were laid out by the court. And we had to move a little slower in the all-day kindergarten and the K-3 class size reductions because of restrictions regarding the capital investments required to accommodate that. Also, there has been a readjustment of the difference between where we are today and what our requirements are on the material supply and operating costs. The numbers that were used back fall in the task force have been reduced by about $120 to $150 million in terms of additional commitment we need to make those up that variance. So I'm feeling pretty comfortable that this $800 million is a pretty significant investment, and when we add the other policies that make up the remaining $86 million, we're at about we are at $900 million in additional movements toward helping kids learn more. I think that's a pretty significant commitment toward it.
How
You
did you
mentioned a 6-year plan to meet McCleary. I guess I just have the details here for the biennium. What's your, meet McCleary means different things to different people. What funding target increase are you talking about?
Maybe I can direct you in your packages to the appendix, if you have a package.
I came in.
Oh, okay, then I'm gonna have to share with you some numbers here in terms of our 6-year plan is $807 million in the upcoming biennium, $2.1 million billion, excuse me, $807 million in the upcoming biennium, $2.1 billion in the following biennium, and $3.1 billion by the end of the 6 years. So we will be in the $3+ billion commitment over the next 6-year program. And as several of you know, our budget we prepare this year, anybody's budget they prepare this year, not only has to be balanced for the upcoming 13-15 biennium, it has to be balanced for the next 2 years as well. We have a 4-year budget balancing requirement in law, which I think is very significant because we've used the gimmicks to get around in the past, moving money back and forth to try to just get us into a budget balancing act, which immediately becomes unbalanced when you look in the next budget cycle. So this time around, I believe all the commitments will have to be valid ones, both on the revenue side of the aisle as well as the expenditure side of the aisle.
I think it's important that you all realize too that percentage of budget, what we move from right now, we're right about 44% of our budget is spent in K-12 education. Just in this next biennium, it moves us up to 46%. And then if we remain on the same trajectory, that by 2019, when our full implementation schedule is completed, we're at 51% of our budget will be spent on K-12 education. So those questions around McCleary obviously the court may be looking at what percentage of budget are you actually spending in K-12, and to me that's a highlight.
Do you also support the extension of the temporary taxes, the beer tax, business taxes?
No, we don't. I've attempted to balance this budget with the help of my colleagues without requiring any new tax revenues, including the continuation of the beer tax and the B&O tax. I do at this point in time have one tax preference that I have included in the revenue, my revenue dollars, and that is for the telecommunication plan. And I think I'm a little light on the assumption even there, but that's the only one that I have right now that's incorporated in terms of new revenue factors.
So just to be
Who
clear,
crunched your numbers?
you would,
Beg pardon?
Who crunched your numbers? Essentially where I'm ultimately coming from is, even if my best guess, and I can be easily shot down on this, is that if you crunched apples to apples between your side and the other side, you probably would still come with different numbers.
No, I don't think that's true. I'm meeting with my counterpart, Senator Hill, on a routine basis. I'm meeting with Dave Schumacher from the OFM director on a routine basis, and I'm meeting with Ross Hunter on a routine basis, the chair of the Appropriations Committee. And when we have big issues such as the Affordable Health Care Act or the hospital rate continuation, we are coming to an agreement on what those numbers are and what to book in our budgets regarding those decisions. In fact, those two items help a lot in helping to balance this budget. We have about $308 million in savings from the Medicaid expansion and a $259 million savings from continuation of the hospital safety net.
And I think just to expand on that a little bit, you talk about the number crunchers. You know, we all use the same staff. It is the OPR staff, so there is little opportunity for people to be massaging numbers to suit themselves. We are using a common and highly professional set of number crunchers that you see every day that you come to hearings.
but just to be clear, you were considering extending the expiring taxes as a tax increase, but you're not considering the extending I-732 suspension as a spending reduction?
No, I would say that suspending I-732 is a spending, it's a reduction from this sort of artificial maintenance level, okay? It's certainly not a reduction from the current biennium, because we didn't suspend it, we suspended it in the current biennium. It's not a reduction from the previous biennium, we did suspended it there too. But if you talk about this so-called starting point of where maintenance level is predicted as being all the existing bills, it is a reduction from there.
So if you're looking at adding $500 million to education, we're also looking at a $1.3 billion shortfall. You guys have identified here, $50 million in savings. So where is like this 1.75 billion other dollars coming from?
I just indicated to you a couple areas. We have we have a little over $700 million in savings in our Health and Human Services area. The biggest components of which are the Medicaid expansion and the hospital safety net. We're also looking at the continued savings from Work First and the fact that we are moving people into Social Security, SSI, out-of-state commitments into federal commitments. We don't do the family leave insurance program again, another one of the suspensions this has never happened. And we delay the nursing home rebates. That's $800 million right there in savings. We're going to continue to, I'm assuming in this budget, in the budget that I'm about to prepare for the rest of the components of state government, that we could expect to get about, right along with the governor. He talks about a more lean government. I'm just assuming that we could get 2% efficiencies in our non-entitlement programs in state government. just by operating more efficiently. That's $100 million. So
So that gets you guys up to 900 million, that's still another $1 billion short almost.
no, I'm not $1 billion. I've got, you know, we basically we have some fund transfers, a couple $100 million in fund transfers. I talked to you about telecommunication. So we have about $500 million in revenue activities on top of the revenue forecast.
What's revenue activities mean?
Well, they're mostly transfers, or in the one case I mentioned, the tax preference.
Okay, so it's sort of more of an accounting trick.
Well, not a trick. We've been using this process for, these are, I only transfer money from other accounts when the other accounts have been fully utilized for their purposes. And I don't transfer money if the,
Essentially, if you're transferring money from something else is going to get cut. What's going to get cut?
well, you're not going to have monies in terms of certain programs, such as your state and toxic accounts, to be able to do everything that you might want to do, or you won't have money in your Public Work Trust Fund to do everything. However, the Public Work Trust Fund, I mean, the governor made fund transfers of $600 million in the current biennium.
It looks like the reduction, the biggest reduction, and I'm trying to look at this on loop, and we don't have it on paper, so I'm trying to do my best to look at it online, but it looks like 700 million in health and human services reductions. So that's Medicaid. I'm interested to hear what you say about Medicaid expansion and doing that, but that's not going to give you anywhere near that much, and I assume hospital safety net is, I don't know what those two add up to, but you're going to need quite a bit beyond that. So what would be some of the cuts that you'd make to health and human services?
I told you I was making reductions on the workforce funding area. We're looking at possibly going to 4 years versus 5 years for the delay in the nursing home rebate and eliminating the family leave insurance program. Those are the biggest components of that.
Sorry, what was the last time? Sorry if I missed it before.
The family leave insurance program, a program
That's
that's
only like
14
million.
Yeah, well, $14 million is not, it starts to add up here. And so we also don't, the housing program that we started last biennium, as you recall, if you look at the numbers, we're only at 36% utilization right now. We're
Which
not.
housing programs that?
Former disability.
That's the Department of Commerce program that was used to replace Disability Lifeline.
And then workforce, you're talking about welfare to work, reducing the timeline, the maximum amount of the grant.
Yes, the child care support, as well as the TANF funding. So, no, it wasn't going to, but I will tell you the important thing is, at this point in time, this budget does not make any reductions in mental health, developmental disability, public safety, support for our elderly, higher education. It actually increases money in early learning by almost $40 million into ECAP. So we are continuing the principles of protecting our most vulnerable populations, ensuring the public safety, and meeting our commitment for higher education being our paramount responsibility.
Isn't, essentially, it's the thing, it just going from just gazing at the programs you cited, you will be taking a chunk out of programs for poor people who are struggling.
Well, that's a question to Mark in terms of the fact that, you know, what you consider to be poor people that are struggling. From our standpoint, the high priority issues to our children on low poverty levels, our elderly, and our people with disabilities, mental or physical. And those are what we consider to be the populations that we need the most support to, and we don't make any reductions to them. I do want to make a comment about something before on just, I kind of look at this budget like an equestrian race, although I've never done the equestrian races where they have to jump over the hurdles, but it seems like in the last few budget cycles, when somehow the administration here needed some money, somewhere it developed, and forecasts came out less, and we were able to have more money to use or less costs to deal with our overall budget. Seems like this particular cycle, the fences and gates are getting higher. And I'm just hopeful it's just because the numbers are what they are, but it seems like they're trying to make it more and more difficult to balance this budget without new tax revenues. This morning, we got the caseload forecast council updates. Caseloads were actually down, something that I've been monitoring and following as I serve in that committee for some time. They're down $60 million. And I was actually expecting caseloads to be down, but through a miscalculation of previous savings from going from the fee-for-service to HMOs, and the Office of Financial Management has now indicated that it will be additionally $361 million increase in our Medicaid assistance costs as a result of those previous miscalculations. So, that's a $300 million hurdle that I have to, and when it's built into my most recent balance sheet, but it takes my reserves down to, close to zero, not counting what we put into the stabilization account. So I just hate to see these things pop up at this late process, and we'll keep working on it, trying to find ways to compensate for it or save it. I'm hoping there's some other tax preferences that we can look at. I'm also hoping that there might be ways. Got one of our members, Kevin Parker, working on Medicaid fraud. He's thinking that there can be hundreds of millions of dollars potential savings to our state. We'll look at that. We're going to examine everything, but I'm convinced that when we finish up in 105 days, we can balance this budget with reforms, resizing, and reductions without new tax increases, and that's our goal. And we thank you very much today for coming out and joining us.